Hello, my name is Troy Wiley. In my presentation today, I will be discussing what I see as the supreme ordeal of our time, one which very well may determine the future survival of humanity. If this sounds dramatic, that's because it is. I will be presenting the story of humanity using the narrative structure of the monomyth, otherwise known as the hero's journey, as put forth by Joseph Campbell. He stated that myths from around the world at disparate times shared a basic narrative pattern expressing the same fundamental structures and stages. This is the same story structure used in many epic novels and movies such as Star Wars and Avatar. I will be overlaying this story with other basic patterns in cultural evolution that I think quite nicely describe where we've been and where we're going. Keep in mind that the cultural evolution I will be describing is also a manifestation of the individual evolution that each one of us goes through. In telling the story, I will be doing so at an altitude of 30,000 feet, so I won't be diving too deep on any of the presented concepts, but I will be providing references at the bottom of the screen if you choose to go deeper. I want to point out that all of my adaptations and interpretations of others' work, as well as any errors, are the sole responsibility of myself. Any ideas put forth by me don't necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the many people I respectfully reference. In this presentation, I will be referencing much of Charles Eisenstein's work, particularly his books Ascent of Humanity and Sacred Economics. In telling my story here today, I will be using the basic three-act play structure, and the subtitle of his book Ascent of Humanity works perfectly, which is The Age of Separation, The Age of Reunion, and the convergence of crisis that is birthing the transition. Keep in mind that it is not necessary to have already read this book or any other books mentioned throughout this presentation. I will be putting the supreme ordeal right up front and discussing in Act 1 the convergence of crisis that's birthing the transition. In Act 2 we will look at some of the historical forces that have formed the age of separation that has gotten us to the crisis point we find ourselves in today. And in Act 3 the arc of history will come full circle in the age of reunion that we are currently entering into. Then I will end with what I'm calling the anticlimax. In my telling of this story today, I will be referring to the age of separation as the old story, the age of reunion as the new story, and in the anticlimax, we will explore the notion of going beyond stories altogether. I will be talking about the many dimensions of human evolution, such as the ups and downs, the open and closed, the back and forth, the round and round, etc. And since nothing is as black and white as the two nights I show here, I will be talking about patterns and gradients and shapes and colors that form the whole story or history of humanity and our cultural development that has brought us to the supreme ordeal that we now find ourselves in. But from a higher perspective, we can see that everything that's ever happened has been evolutionarily necessary to get us to where we are now. All of the seemingly dualistic, oppositional forces or dichotomies that have been playing out through time have all been part of humanity's growing up. So let's begin Act 1 by looking at the current crisis, as I see it, that's converging to bring about the great transition. I've titled my presentation The Supreme Ordeal, but whom are the combatants in this epic war? Is it good versus evil, the right versus the left, the rich 1% against the 99%, the so-called Illuminati versus the sheeple? The traditional and modern worldviews versus postmodern? No, all of that is too black and white, and it's all merely a shadow of the larger and looming supreme ordeal. If we take a higher perspective, we can see that this supreme ordeal is between two opposing forces in human civilization that have been at battle since the earliest days of mankind's history. But now these forces have brought us right to the edge of our own extinction, and we are in grave peril unless one of them overcomes the other in heroic fashion and passes the ultimate test. We find ourselves currently in the deepest and darkest and innermost cave, but we know that we can't give up. We will find our unity and harness the inherent power necessary for the continuation of our species and the flowering of humanity into what awaits us next. But this will only happen if we transcend our flatland dimensionality as we've done before when we realized and accepted that our world is not flat. Once again, we need to change the way we see the world and change our paradigm. So the two opposing forces I will be discussing are those of closedness and openness, or what we might call a closed civilizational paradigm and an open civilizational paradigm. And these two opposing forces, or warrior knights, in this supreme ordeal are erupting everywhere and can easily be seen if you're paying attention. The current global civilization that we've created for ourselves over many millennium is largely what can be called a closed society. So that means that just about everything is owned and controlled and fixed and possessed and not readily available to just anyone. Information, food, knowledge, travel, healthcare, housing, land, and even higher levels of being like spiritual and emotional development are mostly not available to those who can't afford it, or those who were born without other forms of differential advantage. And the closed offness of these things is not because we don't have enough of them, but because that's the way we set it up, intentionally or otherwise. Our systems and institutions, like politics and economics and religions, have certainly undergone some evolutions over the centuries, but they are still largely fixed, controlled, and closed. Those systems and institutions have been subject to the consciousness of the individual people and cultures that have created them, which we will see later on have gone through an interesting history of varying degrees of openness and closedness. But what our different evolutionary eras of humanity have collectively created are closed dominator systems that have now come to dominate us, the people, on a massive global scale never before seen. In short, we've created a monster, one which is closed and rigid and fixed, one which skews and distorts humanity's true human nature in every way, spiritually, biologically, culturally, everything. And this monster refuses to change for the sake of humanity's survival and seemingly is willing to fight to the death. What I see emerging, what I see wanting to be born or born again, as I will explain later, is an open society or open civilization, but this time at an evolutionarily appropriate level, this time at the global level. What is the so-called global open societal structure that I envision? Well, we can see it emerging in the forms of open source technology, networks, and software. We see it in the free self-directed education available online at Khan Academy. We see it in Wikipedia. We see it in Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economics, where he describes how we need to reclaim the sacred principles of gifting and sharing we once had. We see it with the Occupy movement and their free libraries and transparent general assemblies, and new forms of collaborative decision-making. We see it through the watching eyes of thousands of cell phone pictures and videos of police brutality at protests. We see it with electronic products like music MP3s, books, and software that have evolved to the point of ready accessibility to anyone with an internet connection and money. But all of this digital media, not just songs, but images and art and ideas, are becoming increasingly harder to control by the proprietary owners who are trying to profit from them. And there is anything but a free market in the realm of intellectual property. A recent Time magazine article described the patent wars going on currently around the world. Patents are used as weapons in business to control more and more innovation and to no doubt suppress it where it suits a corporation's bottom line. It describes how intellectual property laws used to empower inventors. The article goes on to describe how patents are now used as ammunition by tech giants and greedy patent trolls. In other words, firms whose sole business model is to extract license fees under threat of litigation. So what we really have is corporate warfare, not true free market competition. And instead of patents providing for an open exchange of ideas and innovations that can improve human conditions, more often it seems they are used to control and stifle and prohibit more life-affirming innovations and alternatives. And what about all the words of wisdom I will be quoting in this presentation from many wonderful people? Are their words not part of the universal commons called the noosphere, or the sphere of human thought? Are they not part of the so-called Akashic records, the universal public library of human knowledge? Will the day come when I must get permission from anyone who has relayed a thought or concept to me through a book or a song or a piece of art? Charles Eisenstein said, "The ownership of ideas is just the latest step in a centuries-old enclosure and privatization of the commons. What was once public and free to all has progressively entered the realm of property." So the great battles are ensuing all over the planet, and perhaps one of the most visible battles currently is over the control of the internet. Google co-founder Sergey Brin said in a recent article, "Web freedom faces its greatest threat ever." He said the principles of openness and universal access that underpinned the creation of the internet 3 decades ago are under greater threat than ever. The threat to the freedom of the internet comes, he claims, from a combination of governments increasingly trying to control access and communication by their citizens, the entertainment industry's attempts to crack down on piracy, and the rise of restrictive walled gardens such as Facebook and Apple, which tightly control what software can be released on their platforms. Brin's comments come on the first day of a week-long Guardian investigation of the intensifying battle for control of the internet being fought across the globe between governments, companies, military strategists, activists, and hackers. Thus, we see the ensuing efforts to control and clamp down on online piracy, counterfeiting, control of the internet, control of the commons, control over all the stuff that will either allow humanity to flourish on a global scale, unlike anything we've ever experienced, or to potentially suffer also on a global scale, unlike anything we've ever experienced. To illustrate the escalating tensions and preparations for battle and the supreme ordeal, here are pictures of a recent women's rally in Virginia over abortion and women's rights. The protesters hardly look like violent anarchists, but notice the riot gear. The dark night of control and closeness is raising its ugly head around the world and is seemingly preparing for an epic battle that may likely occur this year in what's being called the global spring. Likewise, the white knight of an open societal paradigm is rising up all around the world in the form of the Occupy movement, as well as many other converging movements, to break loose of the shackles of inequality, control, censorship, and monetary deprivation. People everywhere are rising up to question and challenge the current paradigm that seems to deprive us at every turn of the gifts of life, of humanity, of the beautiful world that is possible. So in short, we have structured our civilization so that almost everything we need, nutrition, shelter, access to knowledge, etc., are all controlled from inside the circle. Even facts and reality and truth are controlled and distorted to the extent that people don't even know what the truth is. And even not so obvious things such as the arts, spirituality, and human development are controlled from within the circle. This isn't any conspiracy theory, it's just the closed societal paradigm that we've created. And almost all of the people, the 99% of humanity, are outside the circle and must be wage slaves in order to have access to such things, if they can even get a job. We have the technological capability to fulfill the basic needs for everyone on the planet, which would advance our society beyond anything we can even fathom. But we cannot do it as long as we are under the oppression of this dark night called the closed system. I think this statement on this Occupy Wall Street website sums up nicely the battle between the open and closed forces in our societies. We are the 99%. We are getting kicked out of our homes. We are forced to choose between groceries and rent. We are denied quality medical care. We are suffering from environmental pollution. We are working long hours for little pay and no rights, if we're working at all. We are getting nothing while the other 1% is getting everything. We are the 99%. So, if we are able to see these powerful forces at play or at war, then perhaps we will be called upon to decide which global civilizational paradigm we want to live in, or what we want our children or grandchildren to live in. If we decide we want to create or recreate an open civilizational paradigm, then that puts us in the position of being maladjusted to the world we have now. I'm reminded of something Martin Luther King said: "There are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted." This is the conclusion of Act 1. In Act 2, we will look at the social order that we've been living under for millennium called the Age of Separation, that has brought on the converging crisis that we are in now. If this sounds like you are entering into a story of doom and gloom, don't worry. Dramatic, yes, but hopeless and depressing it is not, far from it. I am very optimistic and hopeful about the positive future I see for humanity. But we must not be afraid to face our past and the true life conditions of the present. That's where we will find our future. Joseph Campbell said, "It is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life."
Take back the city for yourself tonight. I'll take back the city for me. Take back the city for...
Hello again, this is Troy Wiley, and welcome to Act 2 of The Supreme Ordeal. In Act 1, we looked at the two great and powerful forces engaging in an epic battle currently around our planet. Those are the forces of openness and closedness that take the form as either an open civilizational paradigm or a closed paradigm. Before we take a deeper look at the fundamental drivers of the closed civilizational system we have now and the new open civilization that is possible, it's necessary to look at how the story has played out for hundreds of thousands of years. So let's begin Act 2 and explore the Age of Separation. We now know that historically cultures have grown through, and still are growing through, roughly 7 known stages or eras of cultural development. And in what Terence McKenna has called the Archaic Revival, there appears to be an emerging 8th era that holds much promise of getting us through this supreme ordeal. On a side note, there are many models of human evolution for both individuals and cultures by many different philosophers, psychologists, and social scientists, but they all generally suggest the same differentiated levels. Further, there are corresponding stages of evolution in the external physical realms, like how the human body and brain have evolved biologically and how our technologies and systems have evolved. But for right now, we are looking at the internal realms of values and worldviews, individually as well as culturally. We will see that there has been a pattern throughout human history whereby cultural eras of evolution, which I will describe shortly, oscillate between individual themes and community themes. For the individual themes, it's about individuation and self-expression and satisfying the needs and desires for oneself over the needs of others. For the community themes, it's about sacrificing the self for the desires of others, or sacrificing the individual self for the group. It seems reasonable that both are needed and that we need a healthy balance between individualism and a community orientation. But as we look back through history, what we see are great swings from one extreme to the other. The vertical arrow on the left suggests the spectrum whereby we can roughly map the degree to which an era falls into either the individual theme or community theme. This gives us an almost circular pattern whereby the degree of either individual theme or community theme has grown to greater extremes throughout time, which has brought us to the supreme ordeal we find ourselves in now. And then we see that the new worldviews which have emerged within the last 150 years have brought about lessening extremes of both individual and community themes, which hopefully is culminating in an emerging new era that brings a healthy, combined, and balanced theme called community individualism that will allow humanity to overcome this supreme ordeal. And keep in mind that we have not developed through all these stages in discrete time periods, with all cultures moving through them together at the same pace and to the same degree. In reality, we have different cultures at all different stages still today. But overall, we can generally see where humanity has been and where we're going. The good news is that the hero, in this case humanity as a whole, has traversed the road of trials for millennium. We will see later on how, once we get through the supreme ordeal, the road home will be much shorter, possibly in the very near future, and indeed our own lifetime. So let's take a brief tour through the 8 eras of cultural evolution. The characteristics of each of these is based on the original research by Professor Claire W. Graves dating back to the 1950s. He saw that various eras or stages as part of an unfolding, emergent, oscillating, spiraling process, which was an adaptive response to our changing life conditions. He discovered that the same change process and the same stages of development we can see in the evolution of our species can also be seen in the development of an individual from infant to adult. The first stage of human development was that of survival. This was where archaic man was reflexive, automatic, and instinctive. At this stage, it's all about satisfying individual needs and urges, physiologically and biologically. Then came the tribal stage, where man sought safety in family bonds and communal tribes from the threatening world of mysterious and magical powers and spirits. They followed the ritualistic ways of the tribe. The next era was egocentric, which pushed away from the communal confines. It was a jungle out there where the tough and strong prevailed, while the weak served. It was all about asserting the self to dominate others. It was about egoic power and control and conquest and exploitation. The authoritarian stage then emerged to bring stability and order to the violent and chaotic, individualistic ways of egocentrism. Here it is about obedience and reverence to a higher power that punishes evil and promised later rewards for good works and right living. In this community-oriented worldview, it's about conformity and obedience, usually in absolutistic ways, to the rules of the higher authority, be it their god or their nationalistic leader. Then the enterprising worldview emerged to break free of the communal obedience and conformity. At this stage, the world was seen as full of resources and possibilities to make things better and bring prosperity. This worldview is all about getting ahead and achieving. To balance out the extreme individualism, the humanistic stage emerged, wherein humanity can find love and purpose through affiliation, sharing, and harmony with others. In this worldview, it's about joining together to take care of all humans and the planet. In the humanistic worldview, egalitarianism and anti-hierarchy sentiment is strong, but what is not so readily recognized is that there is a difference between traditional command and control dominator hierarchies, usually patriarchal, and what can be called natural hierarchies, which are also found in nature. In recognition of the culture wars among various worldviews, the integrative worldview has emerged. It recognizes that people at all the various worldviews are convinced that their worldview is the only right one, and everyone else is wrong. The integrative worldview attempts to integrate and embrace the best of all the other worldviews, while recognizing there are healthy and unhealthy manifestations of each. An integrated perspective recognizes natural hierarchies, where some values are simply more true or more life-affirming than others. The integrated worldview seeks to integrate the head and the heart, the inner realms with the external realms, and the best of art, science, and spirituality. While this worldview moves closer to a healthy balance between individual and community themes, it has thus far kept with the pattern by expressing itself mostly on the individualistic side. It strives for independence and self-worth, while building a functional niche to do what one chooses. It brings an existential and systemic perspective, while recognizing that change is the norm and uncertainty is a usual state of being. The neo-tribal worldview is emerging in recognition that what's needed is the biggest circle of care possible for all of humanity. It is recognized in this worldview that each different worldview seems to push away from the one that came before it, which is evolutionarily appropriate. It is with the urgency of our global crisis on all fronts and recognition that the integrative worldview plays a necessary but insufficient role that the neo-tribal or meta-tribal stage has emerged. Neo-tribal sees that the integrative worldview plays a vital, culminating, or coming together role in that it attempts to recognize and respect all other worldviews, and that it attempts to bring an end to the harsh judgments associated with the culture wars. But the neo-tribal worldview pushes off of the integrative stage's attachment to old paradigm reformist thinking, when the current life conditions call for radical, quantum leap, new paradigm thinking and being. In this new paradigm, community individualism is the theme. Non-separation and unity and oneness are all part of it. And whereas all the pre-integrative stages blame the other worldviews, or more precisely, people with those worldviews, and the integrative stage blames consciousness itself for the culture wars, the neo-tribal worldview sees that it is our entire societal paradigm that has now morphed into its current cancerous form, which I will be referring to as the dark night of the closed paradigm, that threatens our very existence. Where some progressives are harking back to the primitive hunter-gatherer lifestyles of the indigenous tribes, and some anti-civilization activists are suggesting that the whole civilization experiment was a colossal mistake, those with the neo-tribal worldview are wishing to call forth some of the values and ways of the tribal stage, but at a higher level, what we might call a post-separation level, taking advantage of all the positive advancements and technologies we've created through all the eras, while jettisoning everything that's outdated and counterproductive to our survival. An important factor to realize is that our circles of influence of the various eras has grown larger and larger. So where it used to be such that what an individual did or what a group did affected their clan or tribe only, then affected their territory or village, then affected their country, and so on, up to today where with the internet, what I do or what we collectively do has the ability to affect everyone on the whole planet for better or worse. Our technology, which is now global in scale, in many ways is outpacing our morality, which could lead to disastrous consequences if we're not careful. So this means that our circle of care, or our morality, has to grow larger as well. And indeed it has. So where we used to only care about our tribe, and then our ethnic group, and then our nation, it is now growing to where we care about everyone on the whole planet, and about the planet that sustains us. Now let's visualize the ages that Charles Eisenstein describes in his book, The Ascent of Humanity. This was the age of separation. This is the coming age of reunion. And here is the converging crisis between the old and the new that is birthing the transition. While I totally agree with this, I also see the converging crisis between what I am calling the more closed individual themes and the more open community themes. In my presentation, I will generally be equating the individual themes mostly with the closed paradigm, as I will explain shortly how that is the very nature of the theme. I will be relating some, but not all, of the communal themes with open, as there have been some communal societies and cultures throughout history that express open paradigms, while others express closed paradigms. Now this may seem completely paradoxical to our current thinking, as most people in the developed countries see capitalism and free markets as central to our current way of life, and that they provide for greater individual freedoms. However, in this presentation, I am making a paradoxical argument that the individualistic themes have led to a more and more closed paradigm over time, and that our challenges can only be solved by moving to a more open paradigm. This is the community individualism theme, where we can have the largest possible circle of care. This time the entire human community, and this time it can't be at the expense of the individual. Now we are all aware of some examples throughout history of positive, life-affirming expressions of both individual and community themes. And without a doubt, there are plenty of examples of violent, life-taking individual and community themes. But we need to be careful not to fall into the same old trap of thinking the answer lies in all one way or the other, in some pure utopian individualistic society or some kind of pure utopian communal society. But one thing is clear, that it is completely utopian to think we can go on the same way, continuing into the future with the same back and forth pattern between individualism and communalism. So what advanced us and evolved us now has the power to kill us. When we break free of the confines of this planet, then perhaps the pattern will reemerge all over again. But until then, we've got to come full circle and join in the field of community individualism. Philosopher Ken Wilber said, "Saving the biosphere depends first and foremost on human beings reaching mutual understanding and unforced agreement as to common ends." And I'm reminded of the Rumi quote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing there is a field. I will meet you there." So is there some kind of field where we can meet in some kind of mutual understanding and agreement? In my interpretation, for our humanity's survival, we need to come together or unify as a global species and meet in this new field that reconciles both the community themes and the individual themes that have been fighting each other for many millennia. Philosopher Slavoj Zizek said, "The current system has lost its self-evidence, its automatic legitimacy, and now the field is open." He also says, "When people say, 'You are a utopian,' sorry, the only true utopia for me is that things can go on indefinitely the way they are." So what is this field that Rumi points to? And when Zizek says, "Now the field is open," what is it open to? If we switch the words around, perhaps we find the answer. Perhaps we are looking for an open field, or an open source field. Perhaps the field is a global open source community circle of care that embraces and encourages the individual, or what some have called the unique self.
Meet me on the other side. I'll see you on the other side.
Author Howard Bloom seems to disagree. He refers to the individualistic themes as diversity generators and the community themes as conformity enforcers. In Sarah Wampler's review of the book The Global Brain, she explores Bloom's thesis. Diversity generators are individuals who test a new hypothesis of the communal mind, exploring possibilities that conformity enforcers would ignore. They spawn variety and open paths to new developments. The conformity enforcers, in the best sense, encourage unity and the pursuit of normalization. In the worst sense, enforcers stifle creativity and destroy deviance. Wampler describes how she sees that Bloom suffers from an obvious bias towards Western and especially American ideals about what makes for a successful and desirable group. She says there is little evidence, either within the book or in the flow of history in general, to suggest that diversity generation is going to eventually win out over conformity enforcement. It is true that most Americans, at least, would prefer to believe in the triumph of the glorious individual over the rise of the scary, repressive collective. With terms like conformity enforcers and diversity generators, Bloom automatically stacks the deck in his favor. Conformity enforcement immediately creates images of secret police and prison camps, while diversity generators are perhaps innocuous artists, writers, and musicians. Several successful contemporary societies rely heavily on notions of collective good and collective will. Bloom's belief in the ultimate victory of diversity over conformity is weakened by his inattention to the successes of peaceful, non-totalitarian conformity enforcers in the non-Western world. And in regards to the scary, repressive collective, not all communal societies were closed and confining and oppressive. This brings us once again to the question of how big is the circle of care. It is true that the earlier communal societies had a smaller circle of care. In other words, they were ethnocentric and often closed to outsiders, closed to only those in their tribe or ethnicity or nation state. However, there are examples, namely with some of the Native American Indian tribes, where those within the tribe enjoyed incredible openness and freedom, and where individual expression was encouraged, as we shall see later on. On the contrary, individualism by its very nature automatically leads to closed relationships. Charles Avila, who wrote a book called Ownership, describes the logic of individualism this way: "If I am my own, and my labor power belongs to me, then what I make is mine." So the word mine or own, as in ownership, immediately creates separation. This then extends to private and thus privatization. All of these terms refer to a controlled or limiting state, or a state of scarcity, where there's not enough to share, where what's inside the circle is mine and not yours, since you're on the outside of the circle. This is not about freedom from something, but instead protection over something. Conversely, the communal logic of true freedom can be summed up by Thomas Jefferson's quote, "Ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe, for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition." This thinking refers to a state of abundance and caring and sharing and higher morality, not for oneself but for the largest possible circle of care, for all of humanity. So now let's move briefly from a circular view to a triangular view. A German philosopher in the 19th century named Hegel described something called the dialectic process. In a nutshell, the dialectic is a back and forth process where there are contracting or opposing tendencies. Put simply, the dialectical method describes how evolutionary development is a result of conflicting opposites. The components of this are thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which form a triangular pattern. The idea is that something is put forth like an idea. If that idea is incomplete in some way, then this leads to an antithesis, which is a conflicting idea. Arising out of this conflict is a third perspective called the synthesis, which reconciles the partial truths of thesis and antithesis, but at a more complete level. Then this synthesis becomes a new thesis, and so on. If we look at the eras of cultural development, we see this dialectic from one stage to the next, where one level transcends but includes what came before it, sort of like the building blocks of a child's development. But what if we step out further and look at the entire history of all the eras? We can see a higher level of the dialectic. If we see all the individual themes of humanity as the incomplete thesis, and all the community themes as the incomplete antithesis, then community individualism becomes the more complete synthesis at a more complete level of humanity. So let's take a look at some of the qualities expressed in both individualistic and communal polarities. Please keep in mind that I am generalizing here. If it seems that I'm exploring opposites in a dualistic either-or approach, don't worry. It will all come back together in a both-and culmination. Under various circumstances, either individualistic or communal qualities might be called for. Daniel Quinn, author of the book Ishmael, has referred to what he calls takers and leavers. Takers are people or cultures whom are often referred to as civilized. The taker culture was born in the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago. The taker story is that they are the pinnacle of evolution, that the world was made for man, and that man is here to conquer and rule the world. The leavers, whom are often derogatively referred to by takers as primitive, take what they need from the world and leave the rest alone. So whereas the taker story is the world belongs to man, the premise of the leaver story is man belongs to the world. Buckminster Fuller said in his book Critical Path, there are two kinds of social behavior manifest today around the world, the benign and the aggressive. He went on to say, we have learned in the last decade, and he wrote this in the 1980s, from our behavioral science studies, that aggression is a secondary behavior of humans, that when they get what they need, when they need it, they are spontaneously benevolent. It is only when they become desperate that they become aggressive, because what they have relied on is no longer working. Two other polarities are power and force. The individual themes historically are more about using force that arises from physical strength or domination in the material world. The community themes, and again not all of them, are more open and more about the internal world of compassion, humility, and sacrifice for others. David Hawkins wrote in his book Power versus Force that force is divisive, and through that divisiveness weakens, whereas power unifies. He went on to say, power serves others, whereas force is self-serving. Power appeals to our higher nature, force to our lower nature. Force is limited, whereas power is unlimited. Perhaps we are arriving at a threshold of power after centuries of force. Next, let's look at the qualities of patriarchal capitalism and the female principle of gifting. Genevieve Vaughn writes about gifting in this way. Gifting creates community, whereas reciprocal exchange creates individuals in an adversary position. She goes on to say, there has been a centuries-long battle between the hidden economic system of the mother, based on gift-giving, and the economic system of patriarchy, based on exchange. The battlefield is not just the planet, but every individual consciousness, and it manifests in power relations in which one logic or dynamic is actually parasitic upon the other. This occurs at the level of the individual mind, body, and at the level of families, of work relations, of races, of cultures, and of governments and corporations, both nationally and internationally, with governments and corporations in the parasite position and the general population in the position of the gift-giving hosts. So this brings us to the final polarity, and in my opinion the most important, that of owner and gifter. Here it is helpful to look back at the history of ownership, and in doing so I will be using Buckminster Fuller's account from his book, The Critical Path. In the archaic survival era, there was no ownership, just control by brute force. Buckminster Fuller said, "Amongst the earliest of human beings, every once in a while a man was born much bigger than the others. And because he was bigger, people would say, 'Mister, people over there have lost all their bananas and they are dying of starvation. And they say they are going to come over here and kill us to get our bananas. You're big. You get out in front and protect us.' And he would say, 'Okay,' and successfully protect them." Describing the tribal era, Fuller said, "We find that territorial battles between American Indian nations were fought over the local hunting rights, but the land itself always belonged to the Great Spirit. To the Indians it was obvious that humans could not own the land, until a special human-produced change in the evolution of power structures occurred. The ownership of anything being unique to the Great Spirit was held by all people around our planet." Here's what Fuller said regarding the egocentric era. "Those who were overwhelmed became aggressive hunters, and those who were not overwhelmed became peaceful domesticators of the animals. Some of the most aggressive men mounted horses, moved faster than all the others, and went out to seek the beasts. Then came enormous battles of gangs, and the beginnings of the great land barons. Finally we get to power structure mergers and acquisitions, topped by the most wily and powerful of all, the great emperors." Then to the authoritarian era, Fuller said, "This is how humans came to own land. The sovereign paid off his promises to powerful supporters by signing deeds to land earned by the physical deeds of fighting and shrewd support of the right leader. Thereafter, emperors psychologically fortified the cosmic aspect of their awesome power by having priests of the prevailing religions sanctify their land claiming as accounted either by discovery or by arms, and then gave each of his supporters control of different parts of that city, so that each could collect his share of the taxes. That was the beginning of the walled city. This is how we came to what is called, archaeologically, the city-state. The city-state was a successful invention for a very long period in history." In the enterprising era, Fuller says, "At this time the power structure of world affairs shifts from control by the city-state to the masters of the lines of supply. Great battles ensued, waged under the flags of England, France, and Spain, to determine who would become supreme master of the world's high seas lines of supply. These great nations, or nation-states, were simply the operating fronts of behind-the-scenes, vastly ambitious individuals who had become so effectively powerful because of their ability to remain invisible while operating behind the national scenery. While the British Empire as a world government lost the American Revolution, the power structure behind it did not lose the war. The most visible of the power structure identities was the East India Company, an entirely private enterprise. The building of a ship required that you be so powerful to command all the skilled people of the nation, to be employed in the building and outfitting of your ship. So there was no way you could possibly produce one of these great ships unless you were very, very powerful. It was at this stage of your enterprise that the banker entered into the equation of power." So this ends Fuller's account of the history of money and ownership in the age of separation, and begins my own interpretation of the convergence of crisis that's birthing the transition to an age of reunion. I think the label for the enterprising worldview is very appropriate and descriptive. Today in the computer and software world, the word enterprise often refers to very large organizations. Wikipedia describes it this way: "Due to the cost of building or buying what is often non-free proprietary software, only large enterprises employ a software that models their entire business system. and this applies to complexity here as well. Sometimes enterprise might be used sarcastically to mean overly complex software. This is reflective of what our socio-political and economic systems have become, not just in America but the world. In an almost unholy alliance, enterprising individuals and corporations have aligned with government to the extent that what we have now could be called a corporatocracy. And if we look at how the military has aligned with big business and enterprise, then we can see what Dwight Eisenhower called back in 1961 a military-industrial complex. But if we look at how all three are aligned, then we can expand the definition to military-industrial government complex, or what some have called the Iron Triangle. So we have this unholy alliance between the authoritarian era and the enterprising era that's grown to a far greater global and dangerous scale than I bet Eisenhower ever could have imagined. And this indeed has led to an oppressive collective, but not by a socialist government the conservatives fear. Instead, it's an oppressive collective of very large multinational companies headed up by enterprising individuals. So instead of utopian free markets, we have a dominating hierarchy where fewer and larger multinational companies control and own and privatize and close off more and more of our commons. But this is no grand conspiracy theory. That's simply what our socio-economic system encourages and rewards. That's just the name of the game. And if you've ever played the board game Monopoly, you know what I'm talking about. I think it is important to emphasize that the enterprising era was also when the American Declaration of Independence was signed and the U.S. Constitution was created. This was a modernistic, enterprising manifestation of the rule of law that emerged from the authoritarian era. As much as one might make the case that this was a great evolutionary step forward, and indeed it was in some respects, one might also make the case, as Howard Zinn does, that this was mainly a way for the rich to protect their wealth and property. He stated in his book, The History of the United States Since 1492, the U.S. Constitution deleted four groups and their interests: those bound by slavery, indentured servants, women, and those who did not own property. He went on to say that by 1787, there was a felt need for a strong central government to protect the property rights of the wealthy and to discourage and control rebellion.
Take back the city for yourself tonight. I'll take back the city for me. Take back the city for
So let's do a quick review of ownership throughout all the eras. In the archaic survival era, there was no ownership. In the tribal era, there was no ownership. 10,000 years ago, in the egocentric era, there was ownership by might. Then ownership by ethnocentric right. Then ownership by money and merit, and what could be called a meritocracy. And merit in this context mostly means the ability to game the system by using the power of money. Then with the emergence of the humanistic era, the whole concept of ownership begins to break down. Dating back to the mid-19th century, some such as Henry David Thoreau began questioning the destructive forces of money and industry and ownership, and our political systems. People with the humanistic worldview began voicing concerns and fighting back on behalf of the earth and the downtrodden, as in Thoreau's concepts of civil disobedience, against the harmful practices of industry and government. So the humanistic view is currently looking to take back some of what has been lost, to bring back what has been privatized, like the commons. It looks to discontinue the practice of shipping products around the world and reinvigorate a connection with the earth through relocalized food production, with things such as CSAs or community-supported agriculture. The humanistic worldview looks to bring about an age of reunion starting with our neighbors and by building local community, but also by taking a world-centric perspective. The integrative worldview has emerged amidst recognition of flaming culture wars that prevent us from achieving a more sustainable world. It looks to bring an end to the harsh judgments amongst all the worldviews. The integrative worldview, since it is an individual theme, has a renewed appreciation for the enterprising worldview and would hope to channel the forces of industry and capitalism for the sake of doing good, in the form of a so-called conscious capitalism, where the triple bottom lines of profit, people, and planet are recognized. Some integrated thinkers embody a certain urgency in addressing our global challenges and recognize the need for building community resilience amid an uncertain future with depleting resources. Other integrated thinkers adopt a more flex and flow mindset that our problems are all part of our evolution and will work themselves out, and that everything is unfolding just as it should. The integrative worldview recognizes the global problems of climate change, poverty, economic crisis, political gridlock, etc., but seems to attribute them primarily to being problems of consciousness. Problems of ownership and income inequality are recognized by the integrative worldview, but it mostly adopts a reformist or integrative position within our existing economic and political systems. In other words, it searches for a balance between free market ideology and government regulation. Some in the integrative community are recognizing the work of a 19th century economist named Henry George. In his book, Progress and Poverty, he pointed out what he noticed as being wrong with our model of ownership, where it seems that wherever there was great progress, there seemed also to be great poverty. George made the argument that a sizable portion of the wealth created by social and technological advances in a free market economy is possessed by landowners and monopolists via economic rents, and that this concentration of unearned wealth is the main cause of poverty. George considered it a great injustice that private profit was being earned from restricting access to natural resources, while productive activity was burdened with heavy taxes, and indicated that such a system was equivalent to slavery, a concept somewhat similar to wage slavery. George's proposal for a land tax fit with the notion of the commons that's being discussed more and more by those within the integrative community. The neo-tribal or meta-tribal worldview has emerged in recognition of the immense value and importance of the integrative philosophy and worldview, and sees that while it is more balanced, it still maintains a mostly individual theme and does so within our current socioeconomic flatland paradigm, all at a time that is calling for a more fully integrated community individualism. Recognition of a conundrum begins to emerge in the neo-tribal perspective with regards to ownership and economics. In a recent article, Jessica Yogini talks about how we've moved from a labor-driven economy to a land-driven economy and now to a knowledge-driven economy. She says this knowledge-driven economy that is trying to emerge needs to be able to do two things at once: reward knowledge producers and turn the knowledge totally free for everyone to use and improve on. No society knows how to do this. She goes on to say, the more that the knowledge economy grows within the constraints of the current system, the more misshaped it becomes and the more corrupted. Because direct compensation for actual social contribution does not exist yet, knowledge must be monetized. The neo-tribal worldview more fully sees that what needs to radically change is not only our individual consciousness and behavior, but at the same time our culture and systems. And it more fully sees that our closed civilizational paradigm is at the root of our global challenges, and at the root of this is our socioeconomic systems, namely our monetary-based economic model. The neo-tribal worldview more boldly proposes, recognizing that practical is no longer an option, an entirely new paradigm, a quantum leap to something entirely different altogether. Although this jump to something radically new may sound frightening, it is actually a returning home, so to speak, to a way we once lived successfully for thousands of years, tribalism. But this time it is at a higher level with the benefits of the scientific method, technology, and advanced automation. It envisions a truly liberated world with full access to the things we need, rather than ownership. It recognizes that our entire socioeconomic system is based upon an infinite growth paradigm, but that we live in a closed system we call Earth that has finite resources. The neo-tribal worldview calls for going beyond merely getting the bad guys in corporations and getting the right political candidate in office and reforming a fundamentally broken system. It calls for an entirely new paradigm altogether, but one that is not only realistically achievable, but perhaps is our only chance. In this worldview, the traditional back-and-forth arguments over capitalism and communism are transcended, since both were failed systems based on the use of money. And regarding ownership, the neo-tribal worldview takes a whole new perspective on the tragedy of the commons argument. Wikipedia describes the tragedy of the commons argument this way: it is a dilemma arising from the situation in which multiple individuals, acting independently and rationally, consulting their own self-interest, will ultimately deplete a shared limited resource, even when it is clear that it is not in anyone's long-term interest for this to happen. Free market proponents say that if each individual shepherd grazes his sheep on commonly held land, then due to the incentive to put more and more sheep on the pasture, the land will be destroyed by overgrazing. So free market advocates say that the best way to protect the common land is to privatize it. Those who advocate for the commons say that the argument is simply false. The neo-tribal worldview asks some new questions that break free of the confines of the ownership circle altogether. Has anyone considered why we discuss ownership of land, but not ownership of animals? What if we looked at making not only the land the commons, but the sheep as well? What if the sheep and the land were not owned by anyone, but instead were held in common, where people had access to what they need instead of having to own things? If people had access to all the wool and milk and cheese they needed, but not more, would this not completely reduce the incentive to have an oversupply of sheep who overgraze the land?
And who will mind the sheep now and keep them neatly shorn?
So the neo-tribal recognition is that the concept of ownership and money in our entire socioeconomic system have skewed the individualistic themes towards an unhealthy expression in our world, which is at the heart of the age of separation. Jessica Yogini says, "The most successful people are a fascinating mix of the most talented and most unscrupulous. A good example of both sides combined in a single person would be Steve Jobs, as the creator of the iPhone and iPad and as an employer in China." And to conclude this section on ownership, the neo-tribal worldview recognizes that the concepts of money and ownership are nothing more than human constructs, which bear no physical relationship to empirical science or natural laws. They are part of a man-made agreement that we have chosen to live under, and therefore it is changeable. Peter Joseph of the Zeitgeist movement said, "The ownership metaphysic is a core premise allowing controlled restriction of resources and goods." In other words, it's a metaphysic, a belief system, and one that is outdated. So just as there has been an unholy alliance among the enterprising and authoritarian worldviews, I am hopeful that a sacred alliance can emerge in the age of reunion among the humanistic, integrative, and neo-tribal worldviews, which is based upon a new sacred socioeconomic system that expands to embrace all of humanity. Let's take another perspective on how the age of separation has manifested in our world. One of the most profound signs of this separation is the Occupy movement's chant, "We are the 99%. Now clearly we are all the 100%, and we are all complicit in this world, although some are certainly more complicit than others in creating our challenges, and must be held accountable. But this slogan points to some major separation and on many levels. So how does this separation relate to our historical eras of cultural development? Well, in my opinion, all of the individual themes are basically about the 1%, and the community themes are mostly about the 99%. I'm not saying here that all individualistic people are selfish elitists. In fact, individuation is what people do as they grow up from babies to adolescents to adults. Likewise, individuation has been a necessary part of humanity's cultural evolution over time. However, the problem is that we have built an entire socioeconomic system that basically favors unhealthy individualism over collective good. So it favors the few over the many, or the 1% over the 99%. We really shouldn't be surprised that we've ended up with the great inequality and all the other social injustices that the Occupy movement protests over. So we need to redesign our social systems to where they foster the collective good for all of humanity, while at the same time allowing for healthy manifestations of individualism. Now, from my perspective, the Occupy movement is the most important movement in all of mankind's history, because for the first time ever it is global in scale, and because it is a big enough open source container to encompass all the environmental, economic, and social justice issues. I think the Occupy movement is a culmination of all the movements around the world that Paul Hawken described in his book Blessed Unrest. But perhaps what's more important is that now that all the issues are in a single container, we can more readily recognize that they all originate from the same root cause, our outdated social systems of ownership and money that have come to dominate us. The Occupy movement represents the white knight of an open paradigm that gives me great hope in defeating the closed paradigm monster. But the monster is not a person or a company or a government. It is critical, in my opinion, that the Occupy movement begins to recognize that it's not just Wall Street, and it's not just government or Republicans or Democrats, and it's not just greedy individuals or bad guys that are at the core of our problems. It's the system that's the problem. Economics professor Richard D. Wolff says, "This crisis is a crisis of the entire global system." He said in a recent interview, "Let me be as strong as I possibly can. This is a problem of our economic system. It is not the fault of Wall Street more than it is of anybody else. On the left, the right, and even in the center, there's a desire to pin the tail on the right donkey, to find a scapegoat, to blame somebody. So if you're conservative, you blame poor people who take out mortgages they can't afford. If you're on the liberal side, you blame the bankers who gave them those mortgages out of their own greed and desire to make a buck." He goes on to say, "I don't think that's the way the game is played. Poor people, middle-income people, and rich people try to make a way for themselves in a system according to the way the system works. Bankers do what the banking system has them do, and the same applies to everybody else. So when all the different people act according to the rules of the system and the outcome is still bad, then it's the system that's the problem. Therefore, to help us make it through this supreme ordeal, I think it's critical for the Occupy movement to shift its focus towards our entire socioeconomic system of monetary exchange and ownership. And we need to come back into unity with all of humanity so we can face the challenges together as the 100%. Now, a brief discussion of conspiracy theories. Charles Eisenstein says, "The true culprit, the true puppet master that manipulates our elites from behind the scenes is the money system itself, a credit-based, interest-driven system that arises from the ancient rising tide of separation, that generates competition, polarization, and greed, that compels endless exponential growth, and most importantly, that it is coming to an end in our time as the fuel for that growth, our social, natural, cultural, and spiritual capital runs out." So if we look back through history, we can see that the scale of oppression, violence, and loss of human life has greatly increased through the various eras. Of course, there have been oppressive and dangerous cultures on both individual and community sides of the spectrum, but in my mind, the most dangerous, both historically and currently, are the individual themes. The individual themes have grown more and more powerful and dangerous over time because of the growing circle of influence. So, back in the egocentric era, the violence of warriors and warlords would span across tribes and clans and local hunting grounds, and was in the form of brute force domination and killing. Then the level of violence grew all the way up through the great conquests and empire building of the enterprising era. Native people, nation-states, and whole ethnic populations were conquered and killed in what was essentially genocide, slavery, and enforced poverty, not to mention all the deaths from centuries of war. In his book, The People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn gave Las Casas' account of the fate of the Native American Indians. Las Casas says about Columbus and Spanish conquest From 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? Thus began the history, 500 years ago, of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in Americas. Now, not only are we still in this enterprising era, in fact, our outdated socioeconomic system has come to dominate across the entire planet. Therefore, the sphere of influence of the violence it perpetuates has grown to a level that oppresses billions, and the form of violence has changed from outright attack and murder with brute force and weapons to what we now have, which can be called structural violence. It refers to a form of violence where some social structure harms people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. James Gilligan, in his book Violence, has written that structural violence is the increased rates of death and disability suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society. These excess deaths are non-natural and attributed to the stress, shame, discrimination, and denigration that results from lower status. And free market individualists often state the number of deaths under communism and socialism, upwards of 100 million according to some sources, far outnumber the number of deaths under capitalistic regimes. But they fail to recognize the number of deaths that happen through structural violence. Kathleen Ho wrote a thesis called Structural Violence as a Human Rights Violation. She said 815 million persons are undernourished, 1.1 billion lack access to safe water, more than 880 million lack access to basic health services, roughly one-third of all human deaths, some 50,000 daily, are due to poverty-related causes, easily preventable through better nutrition, safe drinking water, vaccines, cheap rehydration packs, and antibiotics. So, if we do the math, that's roughly 100 million deaths due to structural violence in a span of only 5.5 years. And this isn't even counting wars over natural resources such as oil.
Why don't the newscasters cry when they read about people who die? At least they could be decent enough to put just a tear in their eyes. But Mama said, it's just make-believe. You can't believe everything you see. So baby, close your eyes to the lullabies.
If we look at the integrative worldview, we can see the danger still escalating. Although the integrative worldview is a much more balanced and healthy worldview, it doesn't mean mistakes can't be made at this level. And when mistakes are made, they can have a much larger impact. Over 1.5 years ago, there was an integrative organization called Project Planet Inc. CEO, who was on a mission to locate the best person in the world to be the CEO of a new company called Planet Earth. I think their intentions were pure, which was to harness the power of industry for forces of good, but can you imagine turning the entire planet into a corporation with traditional top-down command and control leadership? Given the current state of our planet, I think we could do much better than the corporate model that has largely been responsible for getting us where we are in the first place. I'm reminded of the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So I think it would be quite dangerous to put the entire Earth under the corporate control of one CEO. Talk about the 1% to a global extreme. So Project Planet has changed their name, and now they're called the Human Project, and it seems they're headed in a positive and hopeful new direction, where they're asking some very important questions about what this generation can do to advance the Human Project. On their website, I like what they say. We know more, we are more connected, we can think bigger, we can dream bigger, we can mobilize at an unprecedented scale. I agree, and I also agree with their attitude. Let's do it. Let's go all the way. The recent documentary Thrive seems to be waking many people up, not only to the problems we face, but also the possibilities. And even though the film takes a more integrated approach by exploring many non-traditional themes and possible solutions, it still seems to take a dualistic perspective that focuses not on the system itself, but instead on the masters of the system, the global elite. And in a review of the film by Charles Eisenstein, he said, "These people, the elite, are produced and given power by a money system that rests on our civilization's defining myths, scarcity, reductionism, determinism, dualism, separation. The money system and its underlying mythology necessitate the roles that the power elite fill. Remove those people without changing the underlying beliefs, and new tyrants will rise to take their place. Further, underlying much of the solutions the film promotes is libertarian philosophy based on the works of famous individualists like Ayn Rand. While I appreciate the importance of individual freedom, I think Rand's objectivist philosophy can be quite dangerous as it promotes an extreme form of individualism that can be used to rationalize all sorts of injustices. On a final point and counterpoint to this section, Charles Eisenstein said in an article that though some might try to hold on to power a little longer, sooner or later they will accept that their time is over and they will bow out of service. Foster Gamble, creator of the Thrive documentary, responded by asking, "Where is the evidence for this? I do not see any indication that they are going to go away on their own. In my experience, it always comes down to individuals waking up, speaking up, and taking action if we are going to expose and transcend tyranny." So, while the Thrive documentary makes a worthy contribution in some respects, we need to be careful of the extreme individualism that can manifest in a type of social Darwinism, where the name of the game is survival of the fittest. But I think we need to build bridges with all groups and movements working towards positive change, including the Thrive movement, recognizing that they each may have a piece of the puzzle or part of the transition to a better world. And to quote a friend, Nilesh Shmerik, regarding the need for all of us to work together, we need to create a cross-functional and cross-cultural global task force that transcends institutional egos to execute on the global project. We need hip-tied collaboration among all the complementary groups and movements. I agree. Okay, to state it again, everything that we've been through has been evolutionarily appropriate, so there's no cause for blame. But now it's time to grow up. As Anodea Judith puts it, we are an adolescent culture in search of our future humanity. Our maturation into the next era of human civilization will occur through an initiatory process that is at once both personal and collective. She goes on to say that the future of our world depends on the maturity of human consciousness matching or exceeding our technological power. May we all be personally guided as we in turn guide our civilization through this collective rite of passage, from the love of power to the power of love. And speaking of growing up, in her book, Anodea Judith correlates the eras of evolution or worldviews to the stages of growing up. So here I'll be overlaying both of them onto the steps in the hero's journey that humanity has been on and the rite of passage that we are currently in.
1, 2, ready, go! Go, son, big beats, holes in.
Humanity has embarked on a great quest in its evolutionary development.
Find me is where you'll find all is love.
In the beginning, we were born into a scary world and found immediate comfort and safety within our tribe. Then, at a certain point, we were issued the great call to adventure, and where our egocentric self was being summoned, we were being asked to leave the known world and enter into the unknown world. Once we accepted the call to adventure, what an adventure it was. We explored and conquered to express our power. Then we began to question not only the violence of the times, but along with it, the meaning of life. We created great codes of conduct to help with the challenges and resist temptations, and it seems we were quite absolutistic about those codes, so much so that many lives were lost in the enforcement of them. Then we broke free of the confines of the Flatlanders and religious institutions. We went on great ocean voyages and discovered that our world is a sphere. Great empires were built and nation-states emerged. Now we find ourselves in the abyss, the dark night of the soul, the rite of passage, where we undergo a death or rebirth to something entirely new. In keeping with the structure of the monomyth, we are in the belly of the whale. Wikipedia describes this stage of the monomyth. The belly of the whale represents the final separation from the hero's known world and self. By entering this stage, the person shows willingness to undergo a metamorphosis. In our current times, we are reaching the end of the age of separation. The age of reunion is calling for a great transformation or metamorphosis. This metamorphosis is related to what Charles Eisenstein calls the miracle that's needed. If the economic transformation I will describe seems miraculous, that is because nothing less than a miracle is needed to heal our world. So that doesn't mean it's impossible. It only means that it is impossible from our current paradigm. It is incredibly possible from a new paradigm, which requires a transformation, a metamorphosis to something entirely new. That is the revelation of the hero's journey. That's what will show us the road back. Charles goes on to say, we need solutions that exceed the present bounds of the possible. Fortunately, as the old world falls apart, our knowledge of what is possible expands, and with it expands our courage and our willingness to act. So don't fret too much, because as Joseph Campbell said, it is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. It is indeed a rich time to be alive, and the world is full of treasures. Some of those treasures are to be found by looking to the past at what we once had, but had lost, namely our sense of community. Many people are now longing for the sense of community that seems to have been lost. I think this is evidenced by the popularity of the words of Charles Eisenstein in his book, Sacred Economics. At the humanistic stage, we begin the era of reunion. By now, our circle of care, or what we might call our moral we space, has grown from a focus on me and my family only, to the tribal we, to an ethnic and nation-state we. Then, with the emergence of the humanistic era, we take on a global we, where we care for all of humanity and the entire earth. But in reality, how it's played out is that we have these raging culture wars between the different worldviews, mainly among the authoritarian, enterprising, and humanistic, and between the individual themes and the communal themes. That's where the integrative worldview comes in. It is playing a vital role in the age of reunion, or bringing all of humanity back together, which is a necessary step for the hero's return home. But, as I said previously, it is not the final step. The neo-tribal era will represent humanity's return home to the known. This is the known way of life that man has enjoyed in the tribal era, but this time at a higher level. This time based on a realization of abundance and not scarcity. This time with the benefit of our higher understandings of the universe and the scientific method. This time in a more mature level. The story of humanity has been about this coming of age, this growing up. Charles Eisenstein said, your identity fell apart, and then you gained a larger identity, an understanding of your place in the tribe. Therefore, you were an adult, and you joined the tribe for real. That's what is happening now to humanity. We're going through a coming-of-age ordeal that feels like the world is falling apart, that is changing our identity in relationship to nature, no longer separate from nature, and then we're joining the tribe of all life on Earth. So here's the good news I alluded to, but then again, maybe I have a twisted sense of what good news is. Futurist John Peterson said in a recent newsletter that there are increasing indications that significant disruptive events are headed into our near future, events that will greatly disrupt the status quo. That is what gives me hope, the notion that there is emerging, throughout all of the attempts to tie us to the past, a new world that will not be based on fear and control and scarcity, but on a set of values and principles that will dramatically and positively shape and illuminate the way we live in the near future. It's getting there that will be the interesting part. So this is the end of Act 2. In Act 3, the arc of history and the hero's journey will come full circle as we more fully explore the neo-tribal era that holds great hope for humanity, and we'll discuss the interesting part of how we'll get there.
Who doesn't know what I'm talking about? Who's never left home? Who's never struck out to find a dream and a life of their own? A place in the clouds, a foundation of stone. Many precede and many will follow. A young girl's dreams no longer hollow. It takes the shape of a place out west. never tired, but now she won't be coming back with the rest. If these are lives.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Troy Wiley. Hopefully you've enjoyed Acts 1 and 2, and now for a limited time you can get special access to the exciting revelations found in Act 3 for only $19.95. Just kidding. Sorry. Seriously though, I think it is quite exciting to look at some of the new possibilities that await us, but we will do so at no charge. All of my proposed ideas are totally open source, as they are merely the culmination of and build upon the contributions of so many other wonderful people. And to repeat Thomas Jefferson's quote, ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe for the improved condition of mankind. Now let's focus in on a new story. And this new story is a field that existed long ago and is now vacant, just waiting to be occupied or reoccupied, but at a higher level. This new story is the neo-tribal era. Actually, the Occupy movement is doing just that. They are experimenting with newer or perhaps older forms of social organization that look similar to the circular pattern I show here. We are beginning to move beyond the top-down, pyramidal organizational structures that have been with us for thousands of years. Actually, they've more than just been with us. These structures have dominated us. They are what can be called dominator hierarchies. It's been all about command and control and domination and oppression by the closed individual themes over the more open communal themes. What I and many others are envisioning is an open circle of care big enough to embrace all of humanity, all sentient beings, and all the resources that sustain us on this tiny blue dot called Earth. Notice the circle is open or permeable, meaning that when the time comes, individualistic impulse can break free of any perceived stifling confinement of the circle. That time will come when the Earth itself is no longer a closed system, but right now it is, because we haven't scaled up enough, haven't grown up enough yet, haven't changed to an open paradigm yet. If we continue with the closed paradigm we've created on a finite planet with finite resources, we will self-destruct before we ever have a chance to breathe life into other parts of the cosmos. So the circular pattern represents the largest circle of care possible, the entire Earth, where decisions will be based on what's the most life-affirming for the most people. However, within that circle, individual freedom is not only allowed but encouraged. Individuals can create and live and thrive to their heart's content as long as what they do does not affect or dominate or oppress anyone anywhere within the circle. In the neo-tribal context, the non-aggression principle, often espoused by libertarians, gets taken to a much higher level. In a nutshell, the non-aggression principle states that we can each do what we will if it harms no one, and that we cannot use force or fraud against anyone's person or property. But what's always left out of the discussion of the non-aggression principle is the whole notion of structural violence. Our global socioeconomic system, as we've already seen, is the biggest purveyor of structural violence, and not just violence towards people, but towards animals and the planet as well. And this is a system that each and every one of us participates in every single day. If you buy things from a department store, or eat food that came from somewhere else, or drive a car, or own a house, or buy another cell phone, or play on your iPad, or in general participate in the so-called American dream, then you are participating in structural violence. Merely living or surviving in today's monetized culture means it's impossible for any of us not to play a part in the structural violence that's occurring all over the planet. Even if we are living a life that's totally localized and off the grid and not participating in our consumption-based economy, does this relieve us of the responsibility to engage to address the violence that's being perpetrated on the billion others around the world who suffer? Can we innocently stand by knowing that this is happening? Is this the moral thing to do? So let's look at some of the qualities of the neo-tribal worldview. First, we will define neo as basically meaning new or different, or even abnormal. And in this case, I have no problem with the abnormal part. I'm reminded of the Krishnamurti quote, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." Or the Martin Luther King quote, "There are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted." And if we look at the definition of number 3, we see that neo is describing a new world. But what I'm describing here is not the so-called New World Order put forth by anti-government conspiracy theorists or the fundamentalist Christian end-time apocalypse where an antichrist emerges. Although both of these views are based upon flawed notions of our true human nature, that we are inherently greedy, competitive, and violent, ironically, either New World Order scenario could become a self-fulfilling reality if we don't radically change our paradigm. I am calling forth or envisioning an entirely new world based on our true human nature, that of inherent goodness and cooperation. More and more of us, like Charles Eisenstein, are envisioning the more beautiful world our hearts tell us is possible, one filled with such beauty, truth, and goodness that it's hard for us to even imagine under our current cultural conditioning. The neo-tribal worldview recognizes that what's needed now is a unity consciousness. Think of the protagonist Neo in the movie The Matrix. Neo is an anagram of one, or oneness, or of being the one who can bring peace. Now think of the protagonist, or hero, in the new story I'm telling today, the open source humanity that's emerging. So I'm not describing a single individual as the hero. In this story, the hero is our entire human community, or the human tribe, organized around an open source community circle. Philosopher Ken Wilber describes it this way: the one and the many are not two. The ascending and descending currents need to be integrated in the non-dual heart. In other words, the unity of our global tribe is our oneness. And Peter Joseph of the Zeitgeist movement says, "It is time to claim the unity our outmoded social systems have broken apart and work together to create a sustainable global society where everyone is taken care of and everyone is truly free."
Yeah, say, one love, one life, when it's one need in the night, one love, we get to share it.
So, in a nutshell, the neo-tribal worldview recognizes the synergy and interconnectedness of all life on the planet. It looks to restore balance and harmony to humanity and to our Earth. In doing so, it recognizes the importance of diversity that comes from the healthy expressions of our unique individualistic selves. It seeks to create holistic and integrative systems based on cooperation, not competition, which align our individual self-interests with the interest of the communities in which we participate, which is now the global community. Steve McDonald, in his recent article entitled Human Evolution, Who Are We Becoming? A Map for the Archaic Revival, he referenced the original research of psychology professor Claire W. Graves, who described in the 1970s an impending change in human consciousness that would be the most difficult, but at the same time the most exciting transition the human race has faced to date. According to Graves, McDonald wrote, humanity is indeed making a momentous leap in consciousness, which is characterized in part by the reemergence of archaic themes. One of these themes is tribalism, not a regression to ancient tribalism, but the emergence of one global tribe. McDonald summarized neo-tribalism this way: we begin to see the Earth as one complex living system with its own intelligence, and ourselves as an integral part of it all. Now the tribe is humanity itself, and our sacred land is planet Earth. There's a trend towards a non-interfering minimalistic lifestyle that's in harmony with nature while maintaining all the advantages of our high technology. And now let's look at the forms of human organization and leadership within the neo-tribal worldview. I envision an open-sourced circle that contains distributed leadership within. In other words, a communal circle at the largest scale, but with individualism encouraged within it. Kathia Laszlo describes it best. This idea that everyone follows and everyone leads is powerful because it captures the understanding that we are co-producers of our social realities. It is a reflection of the systemic nature of human relations, fluid, dynamic, reciprocal. Evolutionary leadership is shared leadership that embraces the complexity and interconnectedness of the world's problems. She goes on to say, leadership is not static. Evolutionary leadership is an ever-changing flux of interconnections that seek to intentionally create the conditions for the emergence of a better future, or for the good of the whole. And this fits with the notion of distributed systems. Wikipedia describes distributed systems design that's used in computer networks. A distributed system consists of multiple autonomous computers that communicate through a computer network. The computers interact with each other in order to achieve a common goal. The neo-tribal structure of human organization is a non-hierarchical circle, but it does recognize what are called natural hierarchies. Under this model, decisions are not based upon majority rule or consensus, where mob rule and oppressive collectives can emerge, but instead upon natural hierarchies based upon skill sets and truth and accuracy. An example of natural hierarchy can be found when we need heart surgery, God forbid. If you need heart surgery, you call a heart surgeon, not a plumber. No offense to the plumber, but she has no authority to weigh in on matters of heart physiology. Nor does a heart surgeon on matters of household plumbing if she hasn't been trained at it. So consensus decision-making won't help in this case to decide upon what type of heart surgery to perform. Another example of natural hierarchy is when a person happens to be on the 10th floor of a building. It is only natural that they can see farther than the person on the ground. The fact that one person happens to be on the 10th floor doesn't make them superior to the person on the ground. What the person on the ground sees is also quite important in a complementary way. In some ways, perhaps in the way a child sees things, it may be a more colorful and fresh perspective than what the person on the 10th floor sees. We find a similar type of natural hierarchy when it comes to determining reality or truth. Philosopher Gilles Harada explores the natural hierarchy of ways of knowing greater truth and reality. So instead of seeing the truth as relative or spiritual truth as equal to or greater than scientific truth, the neo-tribal perspective is that science offers the highest and most accurate attempt to discern truth and reality. This does not discredit other ways of knowing, but places all of them within a natural hierarchy of accuracy. In short, the hard sciences, using the scientific method, approach a more accurate account of truth and reality than does spirituality and religion, at least in terms of accuracy that can be seen. In question of this statement, some may point out how mystics throughout the ages have been able to access important verifiable truths. The Buddha supposedly used his body and mind as instruments for exploring the inner worlds, and from those explorations he described some of the quantum levels of reality in precise scientific language and detail approximately 2,500 years before the scientific community could verify the accuracy of what he described. So I think we have to stay open to multidimensional ways of knowing truth, particularly if they are verifiable. But at least for now, and until we can be free of the corrupting influences of money and ownership, we need to base our decisions upon the most visibly accurate truths as uncovered by the scientific method. This then begs the question, what if the more accurate hard sciences of math and physics and biology could be applied to making decisions in areas of social concern? Well, as far as I'm concerned, the so-called social sciences of economics and political science aren't sciences at all, since they are purely human constructs and are not based on any empirical, unchangeable natural laws. The only thing that keeps us from radically changing our socioeconomic and political systems is our outdated understandings and agreements and choices. Harada says, the evolution of science has consistently operated according to this pattern. Better measurements become possible thanks to better observations, better technologies, and better methodologies. Previously unknown differences are seen and measured. New structures and new patterns are recognized. New details are distinguished. Each time the overall picture becomes more precise and more refined, allowing the conceptualization of new models to account for what the old prevailing models could not. And regarding the concept of open versus closed paradigms, Harada summed it up nicely with these 2 points. Science is a fixed methodology with an open worldview, and religion is a fixed worldview with an open methodology. Unfortunately, our closed civilizational paradigm and monetary system distort and skew and corrupt the higher nature of our science. This prevents us from fully enjoying the possible advancements that pure, unadulterated, 100% natural and organic science has to offer humanity. And maybe the scientific method might itself one day evolve to an open methodology with an open worldview, and who knows what that might look like. And the neo-tribal worldview, with its recognition of the naturally higher value of science and the scientific method, then allows us to start addressing questions of morality. When it comes to our human organization and decision-making, we can begin making decisions based upon a natural hierarchy of those things which are most life-affirming for the most people and for the most other forms of life, and for the longest term. And science is best suited to evaluate the facts and evidence and answer this question. And when we not only realize this, but start to apply science to questions of morality, then we really can achieve the global circle of care, or the global morality that's required for our survival. Now, let's look at some of the ancient tribal ways that we might look to recreate in this new world, but at a higher level. So let's get one thing clear right off the bat. I'm not proposing that we go back to wearing loincloth. However, if that is your preference, you are free to do so as long as it is life-affirming and does not harm others. Oh, one other thing. I'm not romanticizing all tribal cultures. Many of them were brutal and barbaric. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's not throw out the tribal cultures that lived successfully for thousands of years. The best example I've come across of healthy tribal culture that we would do well to emulate is provided by some of the Native American Indian tribes. And Howard Zinn paints the most powerful historical account in his book, A People's History of the United States, 1492 to present. In fact, his account cuts through some of the most distorting factors of the age of separation. He said, "The historian's distortion is more than technical. It is ideological. It is released into a world of contending interests, where any chosen emphasis supports, whether the historian means to or not, some kind of interest, whether economic or political or racial or national or sexual." This very notion that we need to question all the history we ever learn blows my mind, yet at the same time it opens it. The fact that we can't even know what the real history is, what the truth is, due to political or economic or worldview bias, suggests that we need to give some serious consideration to how we've structured our society over the past several hundred years. I will be reading passages from Chapter 1 and letting the words speak for themselves about the qualities of tribal ways that were present in some Native American Indian cultures. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages onto the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore, carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. The Indians, Columbus reported, are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. The Indians, Las Casas says, have no religion, at least no temples. They live in large communal bell-shaped buildings, housing up to 600 people at one time, made of very strong wood and roofed with palm leaves. They prize bird feathers of various colors, beads made of fish bones, and green and white stones, with which they adorn their ears and lips. But they put no value on gold and other precious things. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token covet the possessions of their friends and expect the same degree of liberality. The legendary Decanawada spoke to the League of the Iroquois. We bind ourselves together by taking hold of each other's hands so firmly and forming a circle so strong that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake nor break it, so that our people and grandchildren shall remain in the circle in security, peace, and happiness. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned in common and worked in common. Hunting was done together, and the catch was divided among the members of the village. Houses were considered common property and were shared by several families. The concept of private ownership of land and homes was foreign to the Iroquois. A French Jesuit priest who encountered them in the 1650s wrote, "No poor houses are needed among them, because they are neither mendicants nor paupers. Their kindness, humanity, and courtesy not only makes them liberal with what they have, but causes them to possess hardly anything except in common." Power was shared between the sexes, and the European idea of male dominance and female subordination in all things was conspicuously absent in Iroquois society. Women in Indian society were treated so well as to startle the Spaniards. Las Casas describes sex relations. Marriage laws are non-existent. Men and women alike choose their mates and leave them as they please, without offense, jealousy, or anger. Children in Iroquois society, while taught the cultural heritage of their people and solidarity with their tribe, were also taught to be independent, not to submit to overbearing authority. They were taught equality in status and the sharing of possessions. The Iroquois did not use harsh punishment on children. They did not insist on early weaning or early toilet training, but gradually allowed the child to learn self-care. Gary Nash describes Iroquois culture. No laws and ordinances, sheriffs and constables, judges and juries, or courts or jails, the apparatus of authority in European societies, were to be found in the northeast woodlands prior to European arrival, yet boundaries of acceptable behavior were firmly set. Though priding themselves on the autonomous individual, the Iroquois maintained a strict sense of right and wrong. He who stole another's food or acted less than valorously in war was shamed by his people and ostracized from their company until he had atoned for his actions and demonstrated to their satisfaction that he had morally purified himself. So Columbus and his successors came into a world in which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence, and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among the Indians in the 1920s and 30s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." So that ends Zinn's account of the tribal way of life among many Native American Indian cultures. And to conclude this account of much of the tribal era, I think Ken Wilber sums it up nicely. It is fairly agreed that in typhonic tribal hunting societies there existed neither large-scale inequality, rank, war, exploitation, nor privately hoarded property. Labor is divided on the basis of age and sex. Rights to the band's territory are collective. Society is based on kinship ties and is egalitarian. Trade consists of reciprocity in goods, favors, and labor. There is no warfare as we know it. Even Becker, intent on disclosing man's dastardliness from day one, found that in the most egalitarian, primitive societies, there is no distinction of rank, little or no authority of one individual over another. Possessions are simple and there is no real difference in wealth. Property is distributed equally. These things are, of course, always relative, but this period of mankind's prehistory was probably the closest thing to a free and non-oppressive society that has ever existed, or might ever exist. Call me naive, but I envision that a free and non-oppressive society can and will exist again. But it is our choice to make. There are basically two paradigms of human organization right now, of which we can choose to live in. One is the closed paradigm that we've been living under and is getting worse all the time. It is the one which is based upon domination and force and control and ownership and exploitation. It involves an immense amount of human suffering and death and destruction, the scale of which continues to grow larger, to the point now where billions around the world are suffering from structural violence, poverty, and income inequality. The other paradigm that we can choose to live under is that of an open civilization. I think the global Occupy protests are pointing to the healthier ways of human existence the Native American Indians once enjoyed. Perhaps the Occupy movement's cities within cities, with their sharing of food, shelter, clothing, books, and ideas, all without money, is harking back to the so-called primitive ways of the Arawak, but with their use of laptop computers, Wi-Fi, internet, smartphones, independent news media, and a global consciousness, the Occupy protesters are including, yet transcending the ways of the Arawak to a global worldview that embraces the use of science and technology for human betterment. I see it as our choice to accept and allow and perpetuate a closed civilization based on an outdated monetary system and the destructive forces it has continually unleashed everywhere, time after time after time, or to evolve to a world of true freedom, of true individuality, of true community, of true harmony with nature, of true civilization. Let us make the shift away from the world that Las Casas witnessed during the European invasion of the Americas. He said, "My eyes have seen these acts so foreign to human nature, and now I tremble as I write." It's as if he knew that things weren't supposed to be that way. It was not true human nature. It is our dominator systems of money and ownership themselves that skew humanity's higher aspirations. And Riane Eisler said in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, in individuals and cultures, dominator hierarchies inhibit personal creativity, but also result in social systems in which the lowest, basest human qualities are reinforced and humanity's higher aspirations, traits such as compassion and empathy, as well as striving for truth and justice, are systematically suppressed. So we're not helpless victims to an evil and flawed human nature. We do have free will and choice, but the first choice we have to make is to topple our dominator hierarchies that skew our true human nature. It is time to move towards a world that fosters our true human nature, that of much more beauty, truth, and goodness. So you may be wondering, how do we ever get there from here? And how can we get all individuals and all societies through to this magical open field of neo-tribalism? Well, first of all, I don't think it's required to get all people and all cultures to the new worldviews. People have a right to be where they are. Some say that we can't skip stages, either individuals or cultures. So the toddler can't skip adolescence and jump right to adulthood. Cultures can't jump right from the authoritarian to neo-tribal. And while that may be true, what we can see from our cultural development through 8 eras is that we have done so at a faster and faster rate. This chart shows what has been called an exponential curve, otherwise known as a hockey stick, although this is actually a backwards hockey stick because it's based on units of time. The more familiar hockey sticks go the other way, so instead of shorter and shorter time spans, there is more and more units, whatever it may be, that pile up over time. It's what's called exponential growth. Chris Martenson, in his crash course, does an excellent job of describing the effects of exponential growth. He points out that oil consumption, the U.S. money supply, world population, worldwide water use, species extinction, and other critical areas all follow an exponential curve in their growth, and all have turned or will soon turn that critical corner. And if we look at the eras of human development, we find that in the last 150 years, which is just a tiny blip in our long history, we see the emergence of 3 new eras or worldviews. In my opinion, these new worldviews, which are part of the Age of Reunion, arose to solve the problems of the Age of Separation, which unfortunately our social systems are still stuck in, which is contributing to the exponential problems we are experiencing now. One thing is abundantly clear to me. With all of these exponential curves peaking at the same time, things can't go on much longer the way they are. We will have some nonlinear change very soon. So, regarding our cultural movement into the new worldviews, while we may not be able to skip stages, we are accelerating through them as the chart clearly shows. So in this new story, our hero, or humanity, can make it back home quicker than one might expect. In other words, it is possible to get to a neo-tribal social arrangement in potentially a very short period of time, which is what is needed if we are to radically address and hopefully solve all the exponential problems shown above. And again, we don't need to get everyone there at the same time. We need a critical mass or a tipping point. A recent study concluded that a mere 10% of our population having a firm vision is all that's needed to make a monumental shift in our paradigm that would positively affect everyone at all other worldviews. And when the biopsychosocial pressures become great enough, what once seemed radical becomes practical. So, as our current paradigm continues to break down, and it becomes apparent that change is necessary for our survival, people will become more open to change. People will begin to fully witness and experience not only the breakdowns in our civilization, but also see what's possible with all the breakthroughs in technology and science, in our understandings and awareness. So if we can get a significant amount of people, namely with the humanistic, integrative, and neo-tribal worldviews, to come together in alliance around the understanding that it's time to move beyond our outdated money and ownership systems, then it is extremely doable. Cracks will begin to appear in the closed paradigm, and pretty soon it will be completely blown open. A global open system of human organization will emerge that encourages the higher human aspirations and traits of people at all worldviews. So to repeat the Buckminster Fuller quote from earlier in the presentation, when people get what they need, when they need it, they are spontaneously benevolent. We have enough abundance on this planet to give everyone what they need. We just have to decide to do it. So why would we want to make the choice to move to an entirely new system rather than just reform what we already have? Well, I'm reminded of the Einstein quote, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." We have been doing the same thing over and over again for thousands of years with our monetary system, and we always get the same results, which are income inequality, violence and suffering, wars and poverty, and resource depletion and environmental destruction. So whether it's barter or credits or gold-backed monetary systems or fiat monetary systems or any other type of alternative currencies, they are all still monetary systems of exchange. And while I have great admiration for Charles Eisenstein and his ideas about sacred economics, I still see most of what he proposes as reform, albeit to a pretty radical degree. Although he discusses the notion of a gift economy, he is not at this point fully proposing moving beyond money altogether. However, he has written that possibly the reforms he proposes could be a transitional phase. He wrote, "Perhaps someday we won't need money to have a gift economy on the scale of billions of humans. Perhaps the money I shall describe in this book is transitional. I am not a primitivist who advocates the abandonment of civilization, of technology and culture, of the gifts that make us human. I foresee rather the restoration of humanity to a sacred estate, bearing all the wholeness and harmony with nature of the hunter-gatherer time, but at a higher level of organization. But I have some fundamental reasons for seeing that his ideas, as bold as they are, will not work unless they are part of a grander scheme of transition to a world without money altogether. The way I see it, the forces in play are so great as to prevent such good ideas to ever come into fruition in the first place. I think this is why Henry George's ideas on land ownership and land taxes, which Eisenstein seems to be advocating, have never made it into existence since he first proposed them 150 years ago. This is why innovations and energy breakthroughs have been suppressed and their patents bought out. And again, this isn't conspiracy theory, it's just what our system does. The force of individualism coupled with monetary exchange creates closed paradigm dominator hierarchies that have always led to not so pleasant results that keep us from reaching our full potential. In one last quote from Howard Zinn, he describes the force driving Christopher Columbus. Europe, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization, and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. Columbus wrote, "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn, and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts. The information that Columbus wanted most was, where is the gold?" So the power and corrupting influence of money and ownership are so strong as to most likely override and prevent any positive changes we might make in the direction of what Eisenstein proposes. And as it is, many people probably already see his proposals as pretty radical. So as long as we're going to be radical and go for the kind of impractical miracle he says we need, then why not go all the way? There is great danger, as I see it, in any type of transition that still involves money. To slightly alter a famous phrase, good intentions can pave the road to hell. In other words, reform may be well-intended and seem practical, but still in the end lead to our demise. As Eisenstein himself has said, practical is no longer an option. I agree, but I go farther in seeing that what we need is a revolutionary quantum leap to a non-monetary paradigm altogether. So here are some of the inherent problems within our global monetary-based economy that Eisenstein's sacred economics address. We have an economic model that is based upon infinite growth and requires and feeds off of scarcity, and so therefore is totally misaligned with nature, and that it actually encourages depletion of our resources and environmental damage. It is a system that is based on unsustainable debt, so economic collapse and income inequality are built right into it. It is a system that depends upon cyclical consumption. In other words, we need people to consume more so that it creates more jobs, so they can consume more, and so on. And we have a growing global population increasing at an exponential rate, so we will need more and more jobs, but as automation and technology continue to advance, also at an exponential rate, we will need less and less workers. And all of these distortions are based upon profit-driven greed and competition in every aspect of life. Thus we are left with a closed civilizational paradigm brought about by separation and unhealthy individualism. At the very core of all of this, the human constructs called ownership and monetary exchange. Eisenstein's ideas about a sacred economics and gift economies attempt to address these issues up top and hold some promise for reversing or correcting many of these. If they can overcome the powers that be and get put into practice, it will be a hell of a lot better than what we have now. But in my opinion, unless you address the fundamental concepts of profit motive, competition, closed paradigms, separation, and unhealthy individualism, we will continue getting everything we always got, meaning all the other dysfunctions up above will continue to reemerge. These items are the distorted human values that are causative of all the other anomalies, and all of these distorted values will always exist as long as the human constructs of ownership and monetary exchange are alive and well. So in my opinion, in the economy Eisenstein envisions, we will still have money and ownership, and therefore separation and unhealthy individualism, and therefore profit motive, greed, and competition that will undo or prevent from ever manifesting in the first place all the reforms that he envisions. Now, some say the original great separation, which goes deeper than money or ownership, was instead man's separation from nature. While I agree with this, here too I see that the split was primarily due to a sense of ownership or control over nature. Once again, to quote Daniel Quinn, the premise of the Taker's story was, "The world belongs to man." Although Daniel Quinn seems to blame this split on the introduction of agriculture 10,000 years ago, Charles Eisenstein makes the case that the split between man and nature started well before agriculture. He says agriculture was not a sudden invention but the cumulative consequence of a series of incremental developments that marked a gradual shift in human attitudes towards nature. He went on to say, agriculture, the archetype of human control over nature, induces dependency and the need for increasing control over land, people, plants, and animals, as the population continues to grow. So in my mind, this control over something was in essence the same as ownership over something, or ownership of man over nature, where the world belongs to man. Then, as agriculture grew, it introduced the concept of labor. Then agriculture accelerated the demise of the gift mentality that characterizes hunter-gatherer societies. Eisenstein says, whereas hunter-gatherers see game and food plants as gifts of the earth, a farmer tends to see them as items of exchange for labor, and it is always his goal to tilt that exchange constantly to his benefit. Eventually, this new relationship of taking and exchanging manifested among humans, setting the stage for the rise of money and property. So while money may not have been the root cause of the man-nature split, ownership and control and money have manifested out of that split, and now are the primary obstacles to us ever healing that split. The question now is, do we need to somehow go back to reconcile this split between man and nature to heal it? I think so. Not only do we hopefully see a reunion with one another, but also a reunion with nature itself. But we have a long way to go. And how do we get there? While there are many environmental groups and causes doing excellent work in trying to heal this man-nature split, in my mind we will never get there. We will never bring about a reunion with nature, or for that matter, a reunion with one another, without first removing the corrupting influences of money and ownership. So more and more people around the world are visualizing what could be called an earth economy, or a resource-based economic model. Jacques Fresco of the Venus Project describes it this way: an earth economy is a system in which all goods and services are available without the use of money, credits, barter, or any other system of debt or servitude. All resources become the common heritage of all the inhabitants, not just a select few. The premise upon which this system is based is that the earth is abundant with plentiful resources. Our practice of rationing resources through monetary methods is irrelevant and counterproductive to our survival. And just to be clear, in a neo-tribal social redesign, private property would not be confiscated or made illegal. Instead, ownership would come to be seen as a cumbersome burden that merely impedes on your true freedom and thus becomes obsolete. Further, it is important to note that the mostly unsuccessful communistic experiments throughout history all were conducted within monetary economic systems and still based upon theories of ownership, albeit collective. In the neo-tribal worldview, nobody owns, nobody needs to own anything, because we have access to everything we need. So here are 7 economic attributes as put forth by Jason Lord of the Zeitgeist movement that are part of our transition away from a money or market economy and towards an earth economy. First, we need to move from a consumption model to one based on preservation. Then we need to move beyond building things to break down for repetitive consumption and move towards optimal design. We need to transition from private ownership or property to an access system that provides for all of our needs. We need to shift from an infinite growth economy to a steady state economy. We need to move from a competition-based value set into a collaborative one. We want to move away from a labor for income model to applied technology and automation unlike anything we see today. And finally, we want to move away from a system that thrives on scarcity and inefficiency to one that provides access, abundance, and social equality. Now, for any of these things to ever come into existence, we first need to become aware of the fundamental problems. Then we need to see that these 7 attributes are actually values. So we need a new value set that encompasses all of these attributes. And until we change our values, all the technology in the world won't help us. And as far as enacting the actual transition, the Occupy movement has already begun the transition by experimenting with new forms of governance outside the established order. It is clear to me that the changes we need won't come from within the existing political establishment. As Buckminster Fuller said, we need to create new systems that make the old ones obsolete. And Peter Joseph said, rather than work to get a seat at the proverbial table, a whole new table needs to be created. So this means that we need new forms of parallel governance and new forms of parallel economics that will eventually make the old systems obsolete. And regarding parallel economics and the Occupy movement, in a recent article, American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, and activist Noam Chomsky had something to say. One of the main achievements of the Occupy movement has been to create communities, real functioning communities of mutual support, democratic interchange, care for one another, and so on. This is highly significant, especially in a society like ours in which people tend to be very isolated and neighborhoods are broken down, community structures are broken down, people are kind of alone. He talks about the unnatural closed paradigm that we've been living under. There's an ideology that takes a lot of effort to implant. It's so inhuman that it's hard to get into people's heads. The ideology to just take care of yourself and forget about anyone else. An extreme version is the Ayn Rand version. There has been an effort for 150 years, literally, to try to impose that way of thinking on people. One of the real achievements of the Occupy movement, I think, has been to develop a real manifestation of rejection of this in a very striking way. The people involved are not in it for themselves. They're in it for one another, for the broader society, and for future generations. And regarding the many ways in which we can bring about the actual transition, he says, maybe we need to develop community-based enterprises which are not at all inconceivable, enterprises owned and managed by the workforce and the community. From very simple things up to starting a new socioeconomic system with worker and community-run enterprises, a whole range of things is possible. But I see all of these things as the means to an end, but not necessarily the end in itself. I think we need to ask ourselves, what is our ultimate goal? Is it really possible to move beyond our money and market and ownership systems altogether? I think so, and so do many others around the world. All of these ideas about the possible transition to something entirely new transcend any one group or movement. There are many organizations around the world looking to move to an earth economy or a resource-based economic model. They not only see it as quite possible, but probably our only chance of addressing and solving our global challenges. And these various organizations are taking an open source approach where they are exploring various ways of living with myriad technologies. So these visionaries are looking to create new civilizations far removed from the centralized, technocratic, elitist world government that some people fear. If anything, that's the type of societal structure we are already living under and hope to break free of. And actually, these new ways of living aren't necessarily dependent on high technology. We know that by using methodologies such as permaculture and by building local resilience and strong communities, instead of achieving a higher GDP that's totally disconnected from what sustains us, we can enjoy a much higher GNH, or Gross National Happiness Index, without any technology at all. And do so in ways that reconnect us to the earth and realign us with natural processes that are sustainable. But a sustainable way of living does not preclude the use of technology. Some people's perspective is that our civilizational wheels are falling off and that the converging problems of the end of oil, climate change, and resource wars, we will be reverting back to a low-tech, labor-intensive, totally localized and primitive means of existence. I must admit, unless we radically change our paradigm, I also see that same bleak future that some people envision as inevitable. But I see it as stoppable. Right now, we have all the technology and resources we need to take care of everyone on the planet. but we just don't have the money. As soon as you take money out of the picture, anything becomes possible. If you open your mind and think deeply about a possible world beyond money, then you can see how we can radically change course towards sustainability. Imagine the impact of the elimination of upwards of 80% of the jobs tied to money that contribute very little, if anything, to human betterment. Imagine how that changes our transportation needs and our energy needs. Then combine that with technology that already exists, like with car sharing and self-driven automobiles, as opposed to the model today where everyone owns their own car that sits idle for 80% of the time. Then imagine the emergence of new technologies, such as nanotechnologies, that will be free of the suppressing influences of the entrenched dinosaur technologies. I imagine a world where cell phones were meant to last and were upgradable from one software version to the next. Imagine everyone having an iPad and access to all the world's books, which are no longer made out of paper. Now imagine that we already have blueprints for all these new ways of living. We do. This is not some science fiction story about a distant future way beyond our lifetimes. This could be our reality in the near future, and indeed needs to become reality soon for the sake of our survival. This is the new story that we need to tell ourselves. It is time to put the old story back on the shelf as a relic of the past and move forward. In the new story, the white knight, the open civilizational paradigm, conquers the dark, oppressive night of the closed civilizational paradigm, and we go on living happily ever after. So is this the end of the story? Maybe. It just might be that time in our human evolution that we are beginning to move beyond stories altogether. Stories and myths and archetypes and epic battles between opposing forces have been with us for a very long time. We are now evolving beyond the old story based on outdated myths and understandings of human nature, which have led to a very long age of separation. We can at the very least adopt a new story, a new zeitgeist that is more accurate, which can help us come closer and closer to actual reality. And with this deeper understanding of truth, perhaps we can finally embrace our true human nature and aspire to all the beauty, truth, and goodness we are capable of. And maybe our next stage of evolution is to reevaluate our entire notion of storytelling. Perhaps we will realize that stories are merely maps of the territory, but are not the actual territory itself. In other words, stories are an approximation of reality. We can see how our stories have become better and better approximations of reality over time. And throughout history, storytelling and myth-making has served a very important role in humanity's evolution and development. But now we can see that our old story is no longer working, and a new story is emerging. And maybe we're not there yet, but perhaps what's next is to move beyond stories altogether. Contemporary spiritual teacher Thomas Hübl recently said, "Humanity does not need a new story. We need to move beyond stories, to where reality actually unfolds. People who are awake are not looking for more stories. They are looking for less stories in order to see life." And when we think of stories, we think of one of the most prominent elements in the story structure, conflict. Wikipedia describes narrative conflict this way: in literature, conflict is the inherent incompatibility between the objectives of two or more characters or forces. By its nature, conflict is unstable. One side must always win and one side must always lose in the end. However, this instability is desirable because it helps hold a reader's interest in a story. So we're used to all different types of conflict in our stories: good versus evil, man versus nature, man versus himself. And we've seen in our story how it's been the individual worldviews against the communal worldviews. But just as we have been falsely led to believe that it's man's human nature to be greedy, competitive, and violent, is it possible that we have been falsely led to believe that conflict itself must always be part of the human condition? Do we humans have an inherent need for conflict, for drama, for competition, where the stakes are always higher and higher? Or is this somehow a manufactured phenomenon to hold our overstimulated attention spans? A case in point is with the novel and recently released movie, The Hunger Games. In case you haven't seen it, I won't give away too much. But in a nutshell, in a dystopian future, a totalitarian elite chooses 2 kids from each of their 12 oppressed districts to compete against each other in a televised game of survival where only one child can survive. Aside from the more obvious messages about social stratification and inhumane treatment, I think the author is trying to communicate a deeper message. Do we not find the idea of pitting kids against each other in a fight to the death for entertainment incredibly disturbing? What I find even more disturbing is the continually escalating levels of conflict in our movies and novels. In the previews before the Hunger Games, I noticed there too that the upcoming movies seem to have ever-intensifying plots with more disturbing conflicts filled with more and more violence. Are we becoming so desensitized and dehumanized by our media and stories that we always need more and more conflict and violence, to the point that we end up becoming what the civilization the Hunger Games portrays? The Hunger Games is like American Idol or The Voice or Survivor on steroids in a dark future where competition and entertainment are taken to extreme levels. I think the film points to important questions that we need to ask ourselves, like, what happens when we let competition overtake cooperation in our culture, in our sports, and even in our game shows to an extreme level? What if we let hyper-individualism combine with the corrupting influence of money and ownership? What happens if our natural-born compassion and empathy are increasingly sapped by our desensitizing and dehumanizing stories? So, do we really believe that for life to be interesting we have to have conflict? If we believe that, then because it is inherently about separation, we will always have conflict. I envision that we are entering an era of anticlimax, where we don't necessarily have to have big drama, great conflict, and the epic battles between all the dualisms and opposites and polarities, and where we can go beyond merely trying to integrate and synthesize the dualisms. Instead, we move into a new territory, a new field, with new ways of thinking and being, where we transcend the dualisms and conflict altogether. This is what some are calling a post-dialectic era, or what I am calling a new tribalism where all humanity is unified. So, in sort of an anticlimactic way, we may find that all of our global challenges, which may seem insurmountable at times, can be solved with the radical simplicity that could be brought about by moving beyond money system. I'm not suggesting that there is anything easy about the transition, but if you study the concepts and think of the implications, you will find a grand, unifying solution that offers us great hope at not only surviving, but thriving. If this sounds hopelessly idealistic, then let us consider our options. If we don't radically change our paradigm, then very soon we will be facing more dramatic conflict than you can even imagine, to the point of oblivion. If we radically redesign our civilization to an open-source, neo-tribal paradigm beyond the use of money, then we have a realistic possibility of creating a paradise compared to how we live today, and for everyone on the planet, not just the 1%. This is not any type of utopian perfect world, because there will always be emergence of something new, with new challenges to face, but we can face them together as one planet, as one humanity. This may be the end of the story for today, and maybe the beginning of the end of stories altogether, but it's not the end of the plot for humanity. Wikipedia describes a narrative plot this way. Plot is a literary term defined as the events that make up the story, particularly as they relate to one another in a pattern, in a sequence, through cause and effect, or by coincidence. So what's next for humanity? What's next in the plot? Here again, if we look at open and closed paradigms, we will see that there is such a thing as an open plot and a closed plot. A closed plot is a single story that has no sequels, the end. An open plot is one that ends with the intent of another book or movie to be coming at a later date. If we can end this book in the neo-tribal era as an open civilization, then we can look forward to the sequel of humanity, and who knows what that will look like. Maybe the patterns of the past will not hold and will start a whole new developmental pattern. How very exciting, and what an incredible time to be alive.
about getting off of these antibiotics? How about stopping eating when I am full of? How about them